to thank you all for getting me to 25,000 subscribers. Again, that's just great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I thought I'd take some time and do kind of a frequently asked questions about Fenders video. We're going to focus on the black and silver face eras from 63 to about 80, 81. There were changes inside the amps, different models to different degrees as the 70s progressed, but the basics stay the same, and a lot of these things apply to the current reissues as well. In fact, I might use a deluxe reverb reissue for some of the shots just because the black panel doesn't reflect light as much as the silver panel does. Let's start with plugging it in. Originally, this amp would have had a 2-prong plug, and you had a 50-50 shot of getting the hot and neutral right because the polarity of the outlets was not, there were different sizes for the hot and neutral, so you could plug it into the outlet either way, and then you would just have a ground switch, which either go that side or that side. Later ones lifted it in the middle, like this one, so you could figure out which way the amp was quietest. And the way the amp was quietest was the way the amp was least likely to electrocute you. But there was always that risk of electrocution because that whole thing sent one side of the power to chassis through a capacitor. And if that capacitor failed, and they do in time, that's why people call them the death cap, you can still get electrocuted. In addition to not being safe, it's not as quiet as having an actual grounded chassis where the entire chassis is always a shield. So you should always have a qualified technician change out the 2-conductor power on an old Fender to a 3-conductor grounded, have them do it properly, and that involves running the hot to the fuse and then to the power switch, and the neutral directly to the other primary. I've seen a lot of crazy attempts at doing it, some of which work but aren't to code, some of which don't really work. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down any rabbit hole, but make sure that it's grounded, and make sure that once the amp is grounded, you never use one of these improperly. What do I mean by improperly? See that this used to have a little metal flange here that someone has broken off? That used to be a little flange that you would then screw. It was designed to be screwed to the outlet itself, assuming that the outlet box was at ground, even if there was no ground terminal in the outlet. And that's how this was designed to be used. But what people do is they just break this off and stick the 3-conductor plug into an outlet that does not have any ground reference. And then the amp is noisy and unsafe again. If you need to lift a ground because you have a ground lift it with an audio cable, not an AC cable. No AC ground lifting, please, please, please. So once this is done, this switch should be decorative, should not be doing anything. Some people repurpose it for negative feedback lifts and stuff, but it's no longer part of the power. This is very crucial. Fuse, 2 amp, slow blow. It's a 3AG fuse. Fuses that we use in guitar amps come in either the 3AG size, which is larger, or the 5x20 smaller size, 5x20 being millimeters. And these are all called cartridge fuses. You can use a sand fuse, a ceramic fuse, or you can use a glass fuse. At the currents that we run into with Fender amps, it's not really that necessary to spend extra for a ceramic or sand-filled, but you certainly can. It is a higher quality fuse, but everything has pros and cons. In this case, the cost can outweigh the pro. And then we come to the power and standby switch. Now, I have done one video, and I plan on doing more in that series later, called Does This Amp Need a Standby? But when it comes to these Fenders from this era, there's pretty much just a hard and quick rule. If the amp has a tube rectifier, it does not need to have the standby switch used, but it is safe to use. If the amp does not have a tube rectifier, use the standby switch. Not because the tubes will die if they are asked to have voltage on them before they've warmed up, but because the capacitors used in Fenders are rated for the operating voltage of the amp under load, and when there is no load present, the voltage inside the amp can exceed the rating of the capacitors. That's pretty much why Leo put the standby in the 5F6A Bassman and the corresponding twin in 58. I might have done it in 57, because he didn't want to have to spend for more expensive, higher voltage capacitors. So he introduced standby. And if you don't know if the amp has got a tube rectifier or a solid state rectifier, looking at the left side, if you have 3 tubes like this, 3 large tubes, 2 of them will be your power tubes. This will be a rectifier tube. If you have 2 tubes but no tube here, you have solid state. Most of the Fender amps which have 4 power tubes are solid state, so there will only be 4. You won't see too many. There are a few with 5 large tubes, usually either 2 large tubes with or without a third tube, or 4 large tubes, no tube rectifier. One of the reasons for that is that the current drawn by 4 6L6s is greater than the current handling of a GZ34 or 5U4 can handle. So that's one of the reasons they moved to solid state. And way too much is made of tube versus solid state in these things, but we're not going to get into that. For right now, just know that if you have a tube rectifier, power it on like this, and that's fine. You can just leave this always in play if you want. Or if you want, you can power it on, wait a few seconds, and take it out of standby if it makes you happy. If you have a solid state Fender, always power it on, wait a minute, then take it out of standby. To power off any amplifier, you don't need to do that and then that. So it's in play. You want to power it off? Just do that. You can then put it in standby, just so the next time you start it off, it's started up, it's already in standby. But what it does, if you have the amp if you have the amp powered on, you do this and you do this, there's no path for the later filter caps to drain at any kind of time frame. So you can store a charge. It doesn't hurt anything, but just something to be aware of. Next, we have the speaker connections. So, speaker, external speaker, total load 8 ohms, 20 watts RMS. Fender used really high quality output transformers that can handle a mismatch. So if you had to use a 4 ohm cab with this, you could. You could use this right here and another 8 ohm going to the external speaker and run a total load of 4 ohms, and the amp will be fine. You could also hook up an external 16 ohm cab instead of this. The amp would still be fine. You can mismatch from 8 to 4 or 8 to 16. If you have an amp like a Super Reverb rated for 2 ohms, don't hook it up to an 8 ohm cab. Don't hook it up to a 16 ohm cab. When you mismatch, you always want to go off by 1. So a 2 ohm Super Reverb, you want to hook it up instead of its internal 2 ohm load to a 4 ohm cab. That's fine. Don't hook it up to an 8 ohm cab at stage volumes. Mismatches need to be relatively minor unless you really know what you're doing. If you forget which one you plug into and you plug your amp in here instead, you'll have almost no sound at all because this jack mutes internally. It was designed that way so that if this amp were operated with nothing plugged in, it would protect the output tubes and the output transformer by shunting this to ground, which is a complete load. It's the having no load which damages things. I see this a lot, especially on Hot Rod series and Blues DeVille series and stuff, where people will plug into the wrong speaker jack. It's not really labeled well on the Blues and Hot Rods, and they won't have any sound, and they bring the amp in to me, and I'm like, do I charge them for this, or am I going to be nice? I'm usually pretty nice about it. But just make sure, if you're only using one speaker, it's the internal connection, not the external connection. The vibrato pedal and reverb pedal connections on the originals have 2 RCAs. On the reissues, it's a single stereo 1/4 inch outside the scope of this video, and they have this connector. So you have a braided connector that goes to the reverb connection. And you have an unbraided white connection that goes to the vibrato pedal. If you mix that up, you're going to have a lot of noise on your reverb. You really want to get it so the braided metal one is on the right and the plain one's on the left. These originals aren't too bad. The reissue pedals that you get, not the ones that come with the Fender reissue amps, because they use a quarter-inch stereo, but the replicas of this vintage one are absolutely terrible, and that white wire is very brittle and breaks off, and it's a real pain in the butt to do. There are better options than reproductions available for this. Still using the RCA, just nicer cable. Then you have the reverb output and the reverb input. And, it's kind of 50-50 whether you have it hooked up correctly. If you have it hooked up incorrectly, you'll have no reverb and you'll have hum. So not a lot to say about that. But I do want to point one other thing out. I removed the rear bottom panel and the bag on this reverb tank for making this video for you. Notice that the connectors on the reverb tank are here and here, facing the front of the amp. If you flip the tank around 180 so that the connectors are here, you'll be noisier. I'm not even sure why that is. It's just a peculiarity of the noise fields that the transformers make, that the tanks are subject to. You would think that moving it over here, the input over here, farther away from this, would be better, but no. With an old Fender, you want to have the reverb connections facing the front of the amp. Let's go to the front panel, where most people spend more of their time. Moving to the front, you can see that there are two channels labeled normal and vibrato. Each channel says 1 and 2. Let me turn the volumes off and put the pots midway. We're not going to really play, I don't think, in this video, but we might in a little bit if I change my mind or if a point needs to be made. But on this channel and this channel, if you take away the reverb speed and intensity from this channel, the two channels are pretty much identical in their controls. You have 1 or 2 input jacks to choose from, volume, treble, and bass. Now, the difference between input 1 and input 2, and that's the same for each channel, is that input 1 has no attenuation at its input, and it has a 1 meg resistance to ground. That's the load that your guitar output sees. If you go into input 2, it has a voltage divider, which is essentially a hardwired volume pot, turning your volume down by about the same amount that on a typical guitar you would get from going from 10 to 7 on your volume knob. So it's a pretty good reduction in volume, but it also changes the input impedance from 1 meg to 136K, which is a lot less than 1 meg. Now, impedance and DC resistance are correlated concepts. They are not the same thing. And I'm saying 1 meg versus 136K for simplicity. That's in parallel with your volume pot. It's in parallel with anything else happening in your guitar circuitry. It's affected by your cable length. It's affected by the individual tube being used. It's not those hard and fast numbers as far as the actual impedance. But it is a pretty useful guide to say that you have a 1 to 10 ratio of impedance. So if this is your impedance, high impedance, this is 10% of that. Almost 2%. Almost 20% of that. Boy, I should script these out, huh? So 136K input impedance, 1 meg input impedance. That will make your sound not just quieter because of the voltage divider, but a little bit darker. It's kind of like rolling your guitar volume down to 7 and backing your tone off just a little bit. It can be a very nice sound. A lot of guys use it for jazz, not just for the sound difference, but because there is no volume control before the first tube stage on either channel. So whatever level comes in to input 1 gets amplified by X amount. And if that gives you clipping or a character you don't like, you can either change that tube type from a 12x7 to like a 5751, which is about the gain factor of 70 versus a gain factor of 100. These are all nominal things. Or you can use input 2 and drive that first 12x7 triode stage less. You lose a little bit of high end. For some genres, that's very traditional and very useful. After that first tube stage, and this is the same on both channels, it goes through a tone stack on the Deluxe Reverb and the Pro Reverb and the normal channel of a Super Reverb. It is, or at least an earlier Super Reverb, the later ones changed that. It is just treble and bass. On a later Super Reverb, on the normal channel, and on all Super Reverbs on the Vibrato channel, and on both channels of a Twin or a Showman, you have treble middle bass. More on that in a little bit. Anyway, these are called the Tonestacks, and they're driven from the plate of the first tube stage, the first triode. And a plate-driven tone stack lowers the total amount of gain from that stage. It's what's called an insertion loss. But then the output of that tone stack goes through a volume control to control the overall level, and then feeds a second gain stage, which more than makes up for the insertion loss of putting the tone stack on the plate of the preceding tube stage. There are a lot of amps that have a boost. People say it's a mids boost, or it bypasses the tone stack and you get a lot more gain. What that is doing is taking away the insertion loss of that tone stack. So yes, you do get more gain, but you don't have a lot of control over the tonality. Now, how does a tone stack work? I thought about this last night. I was going to bed, trying to find sleep, how to best express this. And we're going to use an analogy. And for those who want to say, well, actually, it's just a, for instance, it's just a teaching analogy, so bear with me. Picture a Strat. It's got a neck, a middle, and a bridge pickup, and each one has a different frequency response. We know all that. So 3 different pickups, 3 different tone responses from the same guitar, 1 volume. Imagine that instead of the pickups just being physically different places, but they picked up different frequencies, like you'd be experienced with your stereo. So 1 pickup just does the bass frequencies. 1 pickup does all the mids, and 1 pickup does all the trebles. And each of those pickups has its individual volume pot. That's kind of what's happening from a musician's point of view here. So 1 capacitor feeds frequencies above a certain point to this treble pot, which is a volume pot, which controls how much of that or how little of that passes on to the next stage. 1 capacitor has frequencies that pass everything above a much lower frequency, and it goes to this volume pot, where you can also adjust that. But in addition to working as volume pots, they're also controlling the mix from each other to the output, which goes to the volume pot itself. On a Twin or Super Reverb vibrato channel, there's an additional volume pot that we call the mids control. So you have your bass and its volume pot, your mids and its volume pot, and your treble and its volume pot. On amps like the Deluxe Reverb or the normal channel of a Super Reverb or any other Fender, like a Princeton, that does not have a dedicated mids pot, that's still in the circuit. It's just a fixed resistor rather than a variable pot. And so I've got the treble here at 5.5 and the bass at 5.5. That's noon because these go 1 to 10. It may look a little closer to 6 because the way this is printed, but 5.5 is about halfway through the rotation. On a Twin with a mids pot, and I'll only jump in a picture of me doing this on the Super Reverb while I'll talk to you about this. On the Super Reverb mids pot, people usually set it at about noon, somewhere in the noon area, maybe a little bit above, a little bit below. But that is an audio taper pot. So about 7 or 8 on the Super Reverb's mids pot, which is fairly high to turn it up, is what the fixed resistor is in a Deluxe Reverb or a Pro Reverb or a Princeton. So it's one of the reasons the Super and the Twin can get different sounds than these others, because they have a much more variable mid-range. The Deluxe Reverb, because of that mid-range pot always being, the mid-range pot pretty much on 7 being baked into the amp, plus the smaller cabinet and a single 12, can be a little more mid-range focused than a Twin. Though you can get some overlap if you set your Twin accordingly. So after each tone stack, it goes to the volume control of that channel. Now the deluxe reverb in stock form has a bright cap on that volume pot, but only on the vibrato reverb channel. A super reverb, the twin reverb or pro reverb, and I'll put an insert here, has got a bright switch, which goes from having no bright cap to typically 100 to 120 picofarad bright cap. This deluxe in stock form had a 47 picofarad bright cap. I hate the way pico sounds. Anyway, it's such a tiny little thing. Pico. That's me. It's incorrect to say pico, but it sounds better. Puff is what some people say. But the 47 picofarad is in between no cap and the 100 or 120 picofarad that the bright cap choice gives you, the bright switch choice gives you. I find that even for most players, even 47 picofarad can be too much, and most professional players like to have that cap removed. On the super reverb and the twin and such, which have the bright switch, a lot of professional players just leave that off all the time. A side note, we are playing guitars with relatively small round wound strings these days. And that bright switch on an already bright guitar with already bright strings can be a bit ear-piercing. It can be pretty for some things, used with a discretion, of course. But Fender did not design those bright switches or the bright circuit in this for a guitar strung with nines with round wounds. Strats and Tellys and Jazzmasters, which is what he would have hoped you would have bought with one of these amps, would have come with flat wound 12s. And those strings and those guitars as designed were much, much darker than how a Telly or a Strat or a Jazzmaster sounds to us today with 9s or 10s or 11 round wounds. And so he voiced that bright switch really for round wound strings. So I think if he were to do it all over again, he probably would have gone with a much smaller cap. Something to think about and play around with. Before we move on to the reverb and vibrato and such, I want to mention how a tone stack works besides just being volume pots assigned to different frequencies. It is what is called a subtractive EQ. If you turn this to 10, you're not boosting the treble. You're just having more treble in relationship to the other frequencies. If you have these knobs both turned to 10 and the mids on one of the other amps, you are getting almost the entire frequency as came from the preceding stage. You can't add above that. If you want to have less apparent highs, you turn down the bass. If you want to have more apparent lows, you turn down the treble, etc. But you cannot actually add anything here. There are active EQ circuits in other amps that came later. They've never proven as popular for guitar amps as these passive tone stacks have been. But the entire thing is voiced. The entire circuit is voiced, whether it's a Fender tone stack here or a Marshall tone stack, which is a copy of the 5F6A Fender tone stack, or started off that way, or a Baxandall tone stack you might find in an Ampeg. The designer is making choices of how this pot will react and which frequencies get accentuated where in the turn radius. And so most amps are designed to sound fairly balanced with the knobs at noon. And that does not mean you need to use everything with the knobs at noon. Turn it wherever you like the sound of. But know that this is usually designed to be a neutral starting place. And as a rule of thumb, especially when it comes to Fender and Fender-like amps, if the amp does not sound good with the knobs at noon, it probably has some problems. Now, later Fenders like the 79s, actually it started in 69, I don't know why, but it varied a lot during the 70s. Some of them, the bass tapers are crazy, so you might want to find your neutral just above 3. And some of them, you might have more of a neutral sound with the treble starting about 7. So that's when people talk about CBS not making these things as well as Leo did. while they don't necessarily know the whys, that's one of the things you're describing, where 7 on the treble and just over 3 on the bass would electronically be equivalent to 5.5 on, say, a 65, 66 pre and early CBS amp before they started changing things. And I'm noticing that the knobs are all in kinds of crazy locations on this. And it's a push-pull knob. No, it's set screw good. Before this amp goes home, I'm going to change some of the knob locations so that when they're at 1, which is 0, they all line up with the center line. So you can see this one's way off. And that will get changed before this goes home. So at this point, we have 2 more or less identical channels. First preamp gain stage, a tone stack, which is the same on each channel, a volume, which is the same on each channel, except that on the Deluxe, this channel has a bright cap, this channel does not. At that point, this channel, the vibrato channel, goes through a reverb circuit, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, other than it is got a linear taper pot on the reverb level, which is just a volume pot. And because it's linear, it gets loud really fast. So it's very typical for people to use these somewhere between 2 and 4, and for it to come on really fast. And unless you're trying to go Surf City, you don't go up there very often. You might go 4.5 if you want a big spacious sound with a stock reverb. When I work on these, if I build one, if I modify a reissue, or if I have the owner's permission, these are a lot nicer with an audio taper pot. It just means that the range from 1 to 3 on this becomes 1 to about 5.5, so you have a much wider sweet spot. Now to the vibrato. There's not a lot to say about that. It's an on-off kind of thing. You can make it louder or more subtle, faster or slower. But what I meant to mention earlier in the video, and I forgot, was that a lot of guys say, hey, my tremolo doesn't work, my vibrato doesn't work. I'll ask them what amp they have, and they have a Deluxe or a Super or something. And I will ask, do you have the foot switch connected? And they say, no, I lost that or something. These amps were designed so that if this is not connected, the foot switch is not connected, and the foot switch is not working properly, the vibrato is off. The outliers to that are the Vibro Champ and the Princeton, both of which have the tremolo always on, and the foot switch can only turn it off. But on a Deluxe, a Twin, a Pro, a Super, unless you have the foot switch connected, you will not have any vibrato effect. But there is a workaround. If you hate the foot switch, or the foot switch died, or whatever, or you just never turned it off, you can get or have made a little RCA plug like this. And you can see here I've soldered that wire from the outside jacket to the center connector. And you put that in the vibrato RCA jack on the back where the foot switch goes, and you'll have tremolo, the vibrato, which is always on and always available. You just change the intensity control on the front panel. Now on some of them that can cause a ticking if the vibrato is always on, and that is beyond the scope of this video, but there are fixes available for the tremolo ticking at all times. It comes down sometimes to lead dress, sometimes to old caps, sometimes to dirty boards. Very often we will stick a cap across what we call the roach, just to take off the higher treble frequency spikes that happen. But this can be a very nice thing to have. I'm sure someone out there is selling them on Reverb or Etsy or something. I just make them up, about a $2 RCA plug and 2 minutes worth of soldering. Bam. And I keep making them over and over again because I keep forgetting and leaving them in the back of amps that I then send back home to the owners. So I have made the world a very vibrato-friendly place for a lot of players inadvertently. I think this about does it for this. Let me know if you have any questions that this didn't address. Oh, one last thing. One last important thing. Almost every Fender that comes in has a loose handle, and that just destroys the wood, destroys the handle, and it can endanger your amp. Get a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, and every 6 months or so, make sure those 2 Phillips head screws that hold the handle in place are tight. because once that wood gets all torn up because of back and forth friction, yeah, it's an expensive repair, and it's avoided just by righty-tighty.